projects include develop syntactic Arabic varieties, Arabic as a heritage language with artifact reading, the acquisition of Kuwaiti syntax with Jawla and the Jinai, Kuwait University, and a multi-dialect phrase-based speech recognition and machine translation for Qatari broadcast TV. And this project is with Mark Johnson, Roxanne, Liu and Imam Mustafa and Iqab Kuwait. And the last project is a magnetic resonance imaging with Arab pharyngeals. Also a cooperation with Ryan Shostin, Brad Sutton, both from the University of North Carolina. Please join me in welcoming Abbas Benmamoun to this lecture.
Thank you very much, and Dr. Ahmed, for the generous invitation and everybody for coming today. The introduction talked about some work that I have been doing. Most of it is collaborative, so I have to acknowledge my colleagues as well, who have given so much to the project and enriched my research as well. So what I'm going to talk about today is an issue that came up in our program. I am in the linguistics department at the University of Illinois, and within the linguistics department we have theoretical linguistics, applied linguistics, computational linguistics, but we also have Arabic as a second language. And we increasingly are getting students of second generation background, meaning descendants of Arab immigrants. And they bring a different kind of background to the classroom. So when we started looking at their linguistic background, we realized that, in fact, there is a lot of work to be done that can combine theoretical linguistics, psycholinguistics, and also Arabic as a second language. So what I'm going to report on today is some of the research that we have been doing. But in order to do that, I need to give some background about language in contact, Arabic in contact throughout its history, the state of Arabic in the diaspora, and then give you just some examples of the experimental research that we have been doing, a number of projects. And, but if you have questions, we can go deeper into some of the experiments that we have been doing. At the end, I will close with some implications for teaching Arabic as a second language, pedagogical implications. So this is the outline of the presentation. I will start with the history of contact. Arabic has been in contact since its inception, certainly since the expansion of Islam from the Arabian Peninsula. The language has been in contact. Language contact is the state of nature for language in general. Whenever people from different linguistic backgrounds come together, you have language in contact. And when you have language in contact, there are a lot of scenarios that can happen. You can wipe out a language, you can change your language, or you can impose your language on another language. Or you can have some kind of hybrid system. And all these scenarios have been documented. Then I will talk about Arabic in the US. We focus a lot on the second generation now, but Arabic has been in the US since the beginning of the US as we know it. And then I'll talk about language acquisition and loss, report on the empirical research, and then look about the challenges and opportunities. So this is a map, an old map, of course. Now we have Sudan, South Sudan as an independent state, but this is in yellow where Arabic. This is basically is a formal language, is an official language. And that includes, of course, some countries where Arabic is not the native language for people, like Somalia and Djibouti. But in general, this is the accepted understanding that Arabic spans that geographical area, one of the biggest geographical areas in the world with regard to linguistic expanse from the Gulf, from Oman, all the way to Mauritania. But Arabic also something that we don't pay a lot of attention to, but some people, actually, the dialectologists have been looking at, is Arabic as a minority language. And here you see that Arabic also is found in sub-Saharan Africa. And these are native speakers of Arabic. This is not like Muslims who learn standard Arabic for religious purposes. These are Arabs, people of Arab background who speak Arabic as a native language. So you find this, of course, in Nigeria, Cameroon, Chad, and you find it in Turkey. We have a project actually ongoing now looking at one endangered language, Arabic variety in Turkey, in southeastern Turkey. You have Arabic in Uzbekistan, in Afghanistan, and of course there is Maltese Arabic, there is Cypriot Arabic in Cyprus. So these are other, what we call peripheral Arabic varieties, okay? Where you have probably movement from the Arabian Peninsula, and then the languages became isolated. And that happened in many places. Of course, it happened also in Spain, it happened in Sicily, but those languages died around the 15th, 16th century. But these languages have survived, but many of them are under pressure from the neighboring languages, and many of them, unfortunately, will die if things go the way they are going. As I said, Arabic has been in contact for many years. These are just some examples of the language that Arabic has been in contact with. Berber in North Africa, Coptic in Egypt, Aramaic in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon, Kurdish, Persian, Tajik, South Arabian. These are the languages that are still spoken in parts of Oman and Yemen, Soqotri, Jibali, and then, of course, with colonialism, French, Italian, and Spanish in northern Morocco, English these days, and of course, in Africa, you have the contact between Arabic and many other languages in Africa, particularly Hausa and other languages in Senegal, like Wolof and Fula. And then in Asia, of course, we have seen contacts in Afghanistan, with Turkic languages, contact with Hebrew, and contact with other East Asian languages like Indonesian and Malay and others. So basically, Arabic is global language. So when you hear people talking about Arabic in danger, you know, you make you wonder whether that is really an accurate characterization, because this is a global language with a global reach. And it has, of course, itself puts pressure on other languages like Coptic and Aramaic, and these days in North Africa, in Berber and others. So you are talking about a major language with significant impact on the neighboring languages. Just to give you some examples of the impact of Arabic on other languages, this is just the hallmark. One of the hallmarks of a global language is that you give a rise to new languages when you come into contact with other languages. So for example, Arabic in Africa, you can't hear me or what? Oh, you can. I'm sorry. Can you hear now? Maybe I should come closer to. How about now? Better? Okay. Sorry. As I said, one of the signs of a global language is that you give birth to new languages, basically. In contact with other languages. One of these languages, of course, is Nubi as a Creole in Uganda and Kenya. And, you know, they are typical Creole languages. For example, the subjects and objects pronouns are the same. And you would use, let's say, the participial form as a past tense form. No inflection, basically, to speak of. But this, again, this shows you the adoption of Arabic by other people for communication purposes. And there are also cases of survival of change of Arabic in the diaspora. So for example, this is Arabic in Nigeria. As you can tell, you know, this is as if you're looking at an Arabic variety from the Arabian Peninsula. It has survived there for centuries. It has something that you don't find, let's say, for example, in other varieties of Arabic, like the feminine plural. Okay? But this is Arabic, a native language of these people in Nigeria. Maltese, of course, has survived continuously as an Arabic variety, heavily influenced by Italian these days, but it is still an Arabic variety. I provide here an example. As a Moroccan, I can read this example very easily because all these words exist in Moroccan Arabic, and they exist in Tunisian and others. In the Western variety, Saab means to find, and it is still, you know, please, you know, found. You have the names like Pinot and others, but the rest is Arabic. There is no difference. This Lille here, this is an innovation that happened in the Iberian Peninsula and Sicily. But the rest is Arabic. It still exists as a variety, and it will continue, it looks. Of course, Arabic was put under pressure and, in the colonial period, but that did not really threaten the language in a major way. Because, as you know, lots of Arabs are very nervous about the dialects and about the language, especially under colonialism. And that's not for no reason. There are good reasons why people were suspicious of some colonial designs on the language. Here you see it in the words of the colonial administration in Morocco, for example, that they targeted the language to basically make the common language of Morocco French, because they want to teach Berbers French and Berber, and the Moroccans French and Arabic, so that the common language is French. And you can see that this is not, people did not make this up. This is exactly what the French administrators in Morocco were saying. And so, for example, here, this is from Marty, where he says, we need to change the French Berber schools, French in its instruction and life, Berber in its people and environment. There is no foreign intermediary. All Arabic instruction or institutions would be avoided. So there was an attempt, basically, to diminish the role of Arabic in the area. And this is since Morocco was occupied in 1912, 6 years later, they were already planning language policy to marginalize Arabic as a language. And so there is a reason for some anxiety that people have about the language. Here you look at what we call Anatolian Arabic. These are these Arabic varieties that are isolated in mainly Turkey. This is Sasson Arabic, in a project that I'm working on with the Turkish linguist. We're looking at this variety of Arabic here. The reason I'm putting this up here is just to show you Arabic in contact. When you are in contact, you can influence other languages, as we saw there with Nubi, but you can also be influenced by the other languages. And here you see something that you don't find in other Arabic varieties. You see, for example, here, this is a pronoun like the verb be in English. Now, we don't find that in this kind of context in other Arabic varieties when you have an adjective. But this is what you find in Turkish, in Kurdish, in the languages in the area, in Sasson and southeastern Turkey. So you see that here there is influence from the languages in the area. It is still Arabic, but it is a different type of Arabic in terms of its syntax, in terms of its form. You see, for example, the negative is at the end of the sentence, which is typical pattern that you find in Kurdish and in Turkish. So here you see Arabic is the one that is the recipient of the influence, not the one that is influencing the other language, which is the typical of context, because it's a minority language. It's not the major language in the area. The major language in the area is Turkey and Kurdish, the two languages. Some of them speak Armenian as well, but these are the two dominant languages, are Turkish and Kurdish. Uzbekistan Arabic, you find exactly the same story. Now, this language is severely endangered, but what you find here, again, the influence of Uzbek and the other languages on Arabic. So this Arabic, the words are Arabic, but the syntax is not Arabic syntax, because I put here the one element in red are the verbs, and you put the verb at the end of the sentence in these languages, like what you do in Turkish and in Uzbek. You put the verb at the end of the sentence, and that's what you have. The syntax is a Turkic syntax. The vocabulary and morphology are Arabic. And that's, again, typical of contact situations. The reason I'm saying all this is that when we look at second-generation Arab Americans, we are going to see the influences that are coming into the language from other contexts. I just want to show that this is the natural order of things, how language works when it comes into contact with another language. So let's look at Arabic in the US. As I said, Arabic in the US goes back to the beginning of the US, since basically Columbus landed in the New World. The first attested Arabic speaker was, was a Moroccan, Zamuri, who was basically captured as a child in the coast of Morocco, taken to Portugal, and from there to the New World in the 16th century. But we don't have any, there are no surviving documents in Arabic from that period. The first surviving document in Arabic during the period of slavery was by this person called Omar ibn Sa'id. Now, this was a Fulani from probably Senegal, who was captured around 1800. At that time, he was about 37 years old, and basically sold into slavery and taken to South Carolina as a slave. He was a learned scholar. He was educated, and he used to write in Arabic. As you know, there are texts written, what we call the Ajami texts. So he did write his biography at the end. And this is the only some of the surviving documents by Omar bin Sa'id, but the only surviving documents by slaves in Arabic. This is from the mid 19th century. He died around the beginning of the Civil War, spent about 60 years as a slave. So this is a text in Arabic. I transcribed it, and from this book. But yet, what you see here again, you see it's an Arabic language, but of course you can tell that there is not much. The proficiency is a little bit not very high. So, for example, say, "Ya Sheikh Hunter, anni la instead of la astati', you say la yastati'." And things like that. It could be because he learned Arabic as a second language, or maybe he just forgot the language after so many years in slavery. But this is, again, shows you that Arabic has been in the US for a while. Now, as we know, many languages do not survive in the diaspora, despite valiant attempts by the speakers. Usually by the second generation, you start seeing some weakening, and by the third generation, the language basically is gone. So let's talk now about the heritage Arabic speakers. Well, these are the children of immigrants. Many of them, these immigrants, started going to the United States and to the Western Hemisphere in general around the 19th century. Mostly from Lebanon and Syria, when at that time was under the Ottoman rule. They were mostly from the Levant, but now you are getting more Egyptians, Iraqis, and Yemeni, and there is also an increase in Moroccan immigration to the United States as well. But things might change, because now we're expecting, for example, in the next census, there will be more Iraqi speakers, heritage speakers, because of the immigration from Iraq that we are seeing, and probably gets also more Syrians. This is the distribution of Arab Americans. You can see that it's all over the United States, but of course we know that the heavy concentration are in the coasts and the Midwest. This is the distribution. I don't know, we can see this. This is the latest from 2010 census. Actually, I had, before the 2010, I did something similar to this, and I had the chart, the pie chart from 2007 and from the 2000 census. And it was a different distribution. The Lebanese community was much bigger, one of the biggest, almost half the Arab American population. That it has decreased, and now you are getting more Iraqis and Egyptians, and that's because of the immigration from Iraq. But this is what you see there. Now, why are they learning Arabic? Ali Roshdi did the study, and what he found is that the biggest item was ethnic identity. They want to learn the language because they feel this is part of who they are as Arab Americans. Some of them want to do it for religious reasons. Okay? Fulfilling the language requirements. Okay, the requirements. The school wants you to study language. Said, why not study my language, Arabic? And some parents, and you can see, I'm sorry, we are all parents here, and this is not very encouraging. Parental advice is 5%. You know, the big driver, basically, if you can put the two together, ethnic identity and religious affiliation. These are the things that are driving Arab Americans to learn Arabic. Here is a quote from an Arab American student that we looked at. We got a narrative from this person. And I want you to pay attention not to the grammatical errors here, because a lot of people sometimes focus on what the students don't know. I prefer to flip it and look at what they know, actually. And say, okay, that's remarkable that you know that you have been able to maintain that language in very challenging contexts. And let's see what we can do with that. But here what you see is that اللغة مهم في حياتي, you know, it's not, agreement is not there. اللغة العربية كان قسم في كل يوم في حياتي. It has always been part of my life. It's important for me to learn Arabic. You feel strongly about learning the language. Okay? When you read something like that, you feel that, you know, there is an obligation for us to serve this group of learners. We also get Muslim Americans, and this is an issue within heritage Arabic language research and pedagogy, how to treat Muslim learners. Let's say you have, we get students who come to us who are from Pakistani background, or Indian background, they're Muslims, or Indonesian background. They have been exposed a little bit to Arabic in Sunday school. They may know the script. Do you want to treat them as heritage students or not? But you don't know a dialect of Arabic, unlike, let's say, an Iraqi American, Egyptian American, or Moroccan American. So how do you treat students like that? Do you put them all in the same classroom, using the same material, or do you want to treat them differently? And here you see the distribution of the Muslim Americans. So Muslim Americans are usually familiar with the scripts, as I say. They know a little bit of standard Arabic. And some of them do study Arabic in early childhood. Okay, I talked about that. So now, let's talk about this. So that's the context that we have. We have Arabic in context, and we have this population of second-generation Americans. So what we want to do, the first thing we want to do, you want to diagnose what they know. What kind of Arabic background they bring into the classroom. So we want to study it empirically. We want to know. We cannot just say, okay, I think that they know Arabic, I'm going to put them in an accelerated classroom. We need to do it more empirically. So for example, did they know how the morphology of Arabic works? If they don't know it all, what do they don't know? What is it that they don't know? So that we can have it more targeted instruction than just saying, okay, we'll put you in an accelerated program. So that's what but in order to do that, we have to know how language works and how Arabic language works. Now, if you look at the definition of language, this is what I tried to compact all of it in one paragraph. But language is cognitive, so we are looking at the psycholinguistic dimensions of learning Arabic as a second language. Communication, they are using it for communication. It is a social construct. It displays variation. Some of them are coming to us with Iraqi Arabic, the dialects of Arabic, some coming with Lebanese, some coming with Moroccan, some coming with Yemeni and Egyptian. So we need to understand how these dialects vary, how they are different from each other, so that again we can incorporate that knowledge into how we design materials for these students. This is actually an important thing that I am working with a colleague in New York who deals with, she's a specialist in speech and hearing sciences. And you are getting sometimes Arab Americans who have speech problems, and you want to diagnose those problems well. So again, we need to study them to see what they know so that we can tell, for example, whether they are struggling with the language because of a deficiency in their speech or some other deficiency, maybe incomplete knowledge rather than that they cannot speak. And this is important these days in the United States because we have there are a large number of immigrants in the United States, and some of them need medical attention sometimes. And you need to know what language they know to be able to diagnose speech problems, because speech problems, people come to you as children, they haven't been in school, so you cannot, let's say, test them in standard Arabic. You have to be able to diagnose them in their colloquial dialect. That's a big challenge for the speech and hearing sciences. Languages can be spoken and signed, can be computationally modeled, and of course, it also displays stratification, so, according to different social groups. So, because I was asked to talk about heritage language research, so what kind of questions do you want to ask when you look at language? Well, the questions are, what do we know? So what do these heritage speakers know when we say that they know Arabic? In language acquisition, the idea is that people know their native language, they know the structure, they know the sounds, they know discourse, they know the social linguistics and pragmatic cues. And the other question is that how do you attain that knowledge? And here again, there is a lot of controversy in linguistics. You can boil it down to two main strands. One answer, let's say the followers of Noam Chomsky say, okay, you don't come in as tabula rasa, you have something that you already know. There is already something there, built in. And you use the language that is spoken in the environment, basically, for that, to combine with that system so that you have a language competence that emerges. That's one approach. There is another approach that says, not tabula rasa, but there are some general cognitive abilities that you deploy to learn a language. Now, why is this important for heritage language research? It is important for heritage language research because if we come to a determination that there is a critical period for language acquisition, then we have to see when these heritage speakers have been exposed to the language and what happened to them that they are no longer proficient in the language. Okay? So let me look at some of the evidence that people use: child language, adult language, language deficits, new languages. The speakers that people have been looking at are two: native speakers who attain full language competence and second language learners. So when you look at the psycholinguistic literature, you find we look at the native languages and we look at second language learners. In the research that you are seeing these days on heritage languages is that we say, no, there is a third group of languages, there is a third group of people. And this is an interesting group, as we are going to see. And this group is the heritage languages. Because, as I'm going to show you later, as you can going to see in some experiments that we have done, this is an interesting group. You cannot say they are not native speakers, but you cannot say they are full-fledged native speakers. And you cannot characterize them as L2 learners. Let's say somebody whose background is English or Spanish learning Arabic in adulthood, in college. They are not the same. Because they do come in with some linguistic competence that they have learned as children with no explicit instruction, the way you learn a native language. So in that sense, they are like native speakers. But when you hear them, when you get the data, you see that they display some gaps in that knowledge. As some of those gaps look like the gaps that an L2 learner displays. So in that sense, they pattern with L2 learners. So they are in between. Okay? They pattern with native speakers, but they also pattern with L2 learners. So they are in between. And that's what makes it a tough challenge to deal with, because you really need to know to study what they know so that you can have targeted programs for them. So they don't fit the dichotomy. They get exposed early, but they get interrupted. This is why it is called interrupted languages, these heritage languages, or incomplete acquisition. They have been exposed, but not fully exposed to the language. And that's from language sciences. That's an incredibly interesting phenomenon, because some people say, okay, you just need a little bit of input for language to emerge. Well, Can we quantify that? Because with the heritage speakers, we do have input. Some of them are exposed to Arabic until they are 5 years of age. Sometimes it's the only language that they are exposed to. And then they start going to kindergarten, school, K-12, and suddenly Arabic is no longer the dominant language. It's another language that is dominant, and there is weakness in Arabic. So what happens to the language there? Okay? That's really interesting questions. These are the well-known definition of heritage languages. They are raised in homes where a language other than English is spoken and who are to some degree bilingual in English and the heritage language. Heritage research on Spanish, this is a person who worked on Spanish, is more advanced than other languages. That's understandable. In the United States, it's now the largest immigrant community in the US. Okay, so let me, I want to get to the data. So some research questions, psycholinguistic, sociolinguistic, pedagogical, and institutional. Let me talk about this quickly. So, for example, if you want to look at the psycholinguistics, what do they know? You want to look at the vocabulary, what's their knowledge? What is the lexical knowledge? What is the phonetic and phonological knowledge in terms of the sound patterns of the language? What is the morphological knowledge? How did they put words together? Syntactic knowledge, how did they put words together to form complex expressions? And pragmatic discourse, did they know which expressions to use in what context? What is the appropriate form of the language to use in a particular context? So this is something that I don't study that. What I look at is these two here, morphological and syntactic patterns, because that's what I know best. Other colleagues look at other things. Sociolinguistics, and this is my colleague Al-Berini, who has been looking at this. You want to look at the family situation of these heritage speakers. How many generations live in the home? Because that's critically important. If grandma and grandpa live with you and they might not be very proficient in English, then the grandchild is going to get a lot of input in the heritage language. If only mom and dad, then, and both of them work outside the home, so the child is spending time with a caretaker, daycare giver, or goes to kindergarten or something, or a daycare center, then it is going to be a different situation. So the input is going to be more limited. So this is why it is incredibly important to study that. Is there a big community, for example, that is active, so that people belong in a larger community, so they have functions where kids can interact and talk with each other? And there is reinforcement of the language from a larger group of speakers. So Al-Berini has been looking at this. He did interviews in Utah, and California, Illinois, and Michigan. Connection with the family's ancestral home. Did they go home during the vacation? Did they Skype the family and talk with them on the weekends in the language, in Arabic? So how strong are the connections with the family? Language attitude, how did they feel about the language? How did they feel about Arabic? We saw that quote from the heritage student who said, I feel strongly about this language. It is part of my identity. But is that the same thing for all the heritage speakers? Okay? Because sometimes you may get heritage speakers who feel like, it is an important language for me because I want to work in the Middle East when I get older. That's a different kind of motivation for me to say, I am a Muslim and I want my language because that will help me keep my faith, if you will, or part of my identity as an Arab American, as a hyphenated American. Okay? Media exposure. Now with satellite TV, some families do have Arab TV at home and they watch programs. Some don't. And there is, of course, the diglossic situation. This is the elephant in the room always. And that is, how much exposure have they had to standard Arabic? So they know that actually that there are two codes that coexist in the Arab world. There is a continuum. There is the formal language and there is the colloquial language. Many of them speak only the colloquial language, only the colloquial language. Actually, I remember telling my colleagues when I first recorded heritage speakers, I told them, look, this is, I've been in the United States for almost 30 years, is that the first time I heard pure colloquial Arabic. Because when Arabs get together, there is a little bit of Fusha, there is a little bit of the colloquial dialect. But you have these heritage speakers and you interview them and you are getting basically colloquial Arabic. Okay? It's like, when I went to Morocco and there was the research and I recorded my mom, illiterate, never went to school, speaks only Moroccan Arabic. It was something along those lines. And for pedagogical, and this is maybe relevant to you, okay, you want to have programs for heritage speakers, but do you have the staffing ability to do that? Meaning, when I say staffing, it's not just money to hire somebody to teach the heritage language section, but are they trained to teach heritage speakers? So are they training programs for instructors to teach heritage speakers? How about instructional materials? And I know here this is the best place for that because there are people who are very good at doing this, Dr. Abbas and others who can design this kind of material, instructional materials for heritage speakers. So that's, at the moment, a lot of people, what they use is that they use advanced material, language materials for heritage speakers. But I think at some point we may need to get to the stage where we have some material that is specifically designed for heritage speakers, as we have now for Spanish, for example. Proficiency standards. Do we have good measurements of how to assess these speakers when they come into our classrooms? We have proficiency standards, ACTFAIR standards for standard Arabic. But as far as I know, we don't have good standards for colloquial dialects. And I understand the challenge because you go from the Gulf to the ocean, or to the Atlantic Ocean. So are you going to develop standards for each variety of Arabic? That's a big challenge. So how do you assess these students so you can place them correctly or appropriately? So let me talk about the empirical research that we have been doing at the University of Illinois. And lots of the research that we have been doing is with my colleague, Al-Birini, Abdul Kafi Al-Birini. Now he is at Utah State University. So we have looked at social linguistics, mostly Abdul Kafi Al-Birini, some narratives, word formation, syntax. And we had also started looking at the interplay between standard Arabic and the colloquial heritage language that they know. We want to know, for example, whether knowing a heritage Arabic dialect gives you an edge in the classroom, or is it a hindrance? This is something that comes up in the discussion. And those are legitimate issues. Does it help or does it hinder that? Same debate is happening, let's say, for heritage Spanish. Does it give you an edge? Does it give you an edge when you want to learn Portuguese because they are so close, Spanish and Portuguese? So there's a lot of interest in this community. So I'm going to report on that very quickly. Some of the resources, because I don't have time to go into drill down into experiments and talk about the details, but these are the sources of what I'm going to talk about. Many of them have been published in journals, and some of them are in press. I can make those available. So Al-Birini did a sociolinguistic study of 20 Egyptians and 20 Palestinians, and you always have, of course, the native controls as a baseline for your work. That's always important to do. And he also did oral narrative. He really interviewed the families. He went and interviewed the parents as well to address the questions of how language is treated in the home, the attitudes, how they feel about it, the connection to the ancestral home, all these things. So what he found is that the variability that you find between heritage speakers, he did the regression analysis. So he did he looked at that and said, okay, can we get from the data that we have to where we can say this group is fluent, has better fluency because of these factors. Let's say they have more connection with the ancestral homes, or there is more than one generation living in the home and things like that. That's what he did. It's really a very, very nice paper that I highly recommend. It is now out. So we found that, in fact, language use, not surprising. Many people will say, so what's the big deal? We know this already, but at least he was able to empirically quantify it. So language input at the top, language use at the top, language input, but language that the kids are hearing at home, and the intensity of that input plays a role. The family is critically important here in maintaining the heritage language. Community support, those that have a larger community, let's say like in Dearborn, Michigan, or you have Sunday school. are better at maintaining the language than others who are more isolated. Sense of identity, if you feel strongly about the language as part of your identity, there is a better chance of having a high proficiency as a heritage speakers. And the parents' language, because sometimes you get a mixed family, where the father, let's say, is of Arabic background, or the mother's of Arabic background, but the other spouse is of a different background. Okay? So you are getting input from only one single parent, not from both parents. Or you may have 2 or 3 languages, both of them are immigrants. So we have cases, let's say, for example, where the father or the mother may be Arab and the others is Polish, or French or German. You are getting different kind of languages. We also looked at some narratives. We just recorded them and said, okay, tell us about yourself, tell us some stories. And that was really an interesting to look at. But what we want also to see is that the size of their vocabulary relative to the native controls. And what you want to focus on is this one here, this part here. This is the number of words per minute that they utter, they speak. So for example, when you look at the Egyptian heritage speakers, it's about 42 words per minute. It's quite an achievement for a heritage speaker, by the way. But they are still not as high. It's less than half the native controls. Okay? And by the way, they are talking about the same topic. We made sure of that they are talking about exactly the same thing. We are not like dealing with different topics. The Palestinians, this is actually a very interesting finding that we have something that we have consistently found in our study of the heritage speakers. Palestinians do much better than other heritage speakers of Arabic in maintaining the language. And one can think about various reasons why that is the case, including sense of identity. Many Palestinian families are larger families in the sense that you have also the grandparents living with the grandkids. So that may help as well. So there are lots of variables. But this is one of the interesting issues that need further investigation. Because we looked at plurals and others, we found the same differences between these 2 groups of speakers. And we thought, okay, what's going on here? What are the differences? But you see here, actually, there is a significant difference between the heritage and the control, We also looked at the morphology, plural formation. As you know, for those, if you are not familiar with Arabic, Arabic has 2 patterns of plural formation. One is like, let's say, what you have in English, books. You add something at the end of the word to make it plural. And there is another way to form plurals in Arabic that is very productive, and actually it's the majority of the plurals in Arabic. And that is what we call the broken plurals. What it means is that it's mostly vowel change rather than adding something at the periphery of the word. So it will be almost what you have, the pattern that you find in English with foot and feet, but on a larger scale. Think of it that way, okay? So the hypothesis is that the pattern where you take the singular and you attach something to it should be easier than the one where you have to modify the internal vocalic pattern of the word, because that's really, you have to extract the root. You have to know what the roots are in the language and then map them on that pattern, okay? So it is kind of a more difficult job. And this is not new, of course. People who looked at children, Arab children, learning Arabic found the same thing, that children do better at the beginning on what we call the sound pattern, namely suffixation, versus broken plurals, namely internal modification. So we want to see how heritage speakers do. But we made their job more difficult because we also looked at, this is something that other people have not looked at, we looked at different types of roots, because in Arabic, there are what we call sound roots, where you have consonants, let's say 3 consonants, like KTB for kataba, for example. But you also have defective roots. Defective roots where you have something like a glide, like a wa or a ya in the word. Now those are tough because sometimes they'll become long vowels. So instead of saying bait, you say bet. So there is a hidden consonant in there that you don't see. But when you form the plural, that consonant comes out. So we want to know whether heritage speakers can pick that up. When they see a word with two consonants, they think three. There is something in there. And therefore, when I form the plural, I am going to retrieve that third consonant that is hidden in the singular. So we wanted to see with it, because Arabs can do it very easily as native speakers. So we want to see whether heritage speakers, if they have received this language early, whether they have been able to get that. The other thing is that when you have a geminate consonant, so when you have, let's say, Jad, grandfather. Now you hear only two consonants. When you write it, it's only two consonants, but actually there are three in there because the second one is doubled consonant. The doubled one, the geminate. When we form the plural, we break the geminate, we put vowels between the two consonants of the geminate. So we say judud. Okay? So again, we want to see with the heritage speakers, how did they do on that? You know, how can they pick up those roots? Because you cannot just give them sound roots and say, okay, they are doing fantastically, what they are doing like native speakers. If you don't look at the others, you might miss that. And actually what we found is that they don't do as well on the defective roots, on the weaker roots, on the geminate roots. And that is really an interesting finding was. So here is the data. This is the overall performance on plural formation. We also looked at the L2 learners. These are people of no Arab background. Okay, these are, let's say, adult English speakers learning Arabic as a second language. So we tested them as well so that we have a three-way comparison. We have the L2 learners, we have the heritage speakers, and we have the baseline, the native speakers. And as you can see here, again, what I talked about, some heritage speakers in the middle. Here they are, on the performance on the plural. They don't do as well as the native speakers, but they do much better than the L2 learners. So they know something, but not close to the native speakers. So what you want to do is you want to get them from here to here. And of course you want to get this group as well, from here to here, or as close as possible. Okay. This is the sound and broken plurals, and you can see here, the broken plurals in white, the L2 learners are not doing very well. Heritage speakers are also really not doing very well, much better, but the performance degrades when you compare it to the sound plurals. So they have problems with the broken plurals. And here are the broken plurals that I talked about, the different patterns. We looked at 6 patterns of the broken plurals. But I want you just to pay attention to these here, the defective patterns, the geminate and the defective patterns. And what you see here, the L2 learners, they have problems with the geminate consonants. They do a 12% performance. Okay? And the heritage speakers much better, but not fantastically well. It's about 30% accuracy rate. And the defective ones where you have the glide, you have the wa and the ya, sometimes realized as a long vowel, in the plural as a consonant. Again, the performance is not really very good. So these are things that, why we are doing this is that these are the things probably that we should focus on when we work with these students. Give them more input on the geminates, on defective roots, and things like that. So let me move let's see if I can get to negation. I know I'm running out of time, so I'll move very quickly. We also looked at negation in Egyptian Arabic syntax. And here you can see the overall performance of the heritage speakers, very close to the native, but not quite there. We looked at, in Arabic, you have negation working in 2 different ways. When you have a verb and when you don't have a verb. When you don't have a verb, it's the nominal sentence, jumla ismiya. The syntax is simpler, okay? So they do much better on the verbless sentences than on the verbal sentences. And actually, we did the same test on standard Arabic. This is on Egyptian. The same thing, you find the same dichotomy between verbless sentences. And when we looked at the the verbless sentences, for example, we look at when you have a nominal predicate, adjectival predicate, or prepositional predicate, they do very well. But the present tense, they do much better in Egyptian, but they have problems with the future and the past. And the future, as you know, in Egyptian is a tough construction. The reason is that it has a verb, but its syntax is like this one, because it used the mish pattern, not the discontinuous pattern. This is for the Egyptians who know the Egyptian syntax. The future, because it's rah or ha, mish hayiktub, you know. So it's almost like as if you are using it with a noun. So they have this kind of like, they don't know where to go with it. Existential and imperative, let me skip that. So this is about learning standard Arabic. Does it give them an edge? Does knowledge of heritage Arabic give you an edge as a heritage student in the classroom? So here, what we did is that we looked at elementary heritage speakers, advanced heritage speakers. So this is in the elementary classes, in the advanced classes. We looked at L2 learners, and of course, we always have the controls. Let me give you just here, as you can see, overall performance. Natives doing very well. L2 learners, this is really interesting. This is standard Arabic negation. For those who know the Arabic, standard Arabic negation is different from colloquial negation because you have lem and len and you have laysa, that they don't exist. They don't exist in the colloquial dialect. So learning something completely new, but there are patterns that overlap with the colloquial. And here what you see is that because this is learning a brand new pattern that you don't find in your dialect, L2 learners do much better than the elementary heritage speakers. This is where you have to be careful because I when I was supervising the Arabic program, instructors will tell me, we have heritage students. They know Arabic already. I said, we have really to be careful. We have to test them to make sure that when we say they know Arabic, we can characterize what they know. So for example, they might do better on the sound plural. They might do better on plurals with sound roots. But let's check how they do on the geminates, how they do on the defective roots, and how they do on standard Arabic negation. And when you look at that, you find that L2 learners do much better than this. This is actually a question that came up this morning, is that, is this the case where knowing the colloquial dialects may be some kind of obstacle to you, because you already know this, so it is like a hindering your acquisition of the standard language. Again, I would spend more time teaching them the lem and the len laysa patterns than on the others. But advanced heritage, they pick it up, okay? They do much better. They have figured it out. They said, okay, this is the colloquial system, this is the standard system, and they acquire it. So again, I would pay more attention to the elementary heritage speakers. So let me just, because I need to close, so let's, a lot of data in there. We looked at other morphological patterns. They do well on agreement with verbs, not very well on agreement with adjectives, though the agreement of the adjective is simpler than with the verbs. Because with verbs you have large patterns, paradigms, but still that's understandable. Many languages you find the same thing. They prefer the English word order, the Arabic word order. They prefer the analytic state over idafa, the construct state, and they have difficulties with the dual number on nouns. It doesn't exist in English. Maybe the exposure is not there. That's enough input for them to acquire the dual. The dual should be simpler because it's a suffix, like the sound plural. But still, they don't do well on the dual. It's just because it is a new thing for them. If you are being exposed to English, there is no dual in the language. So this is something new. So that's something I would focus on if I am working with heritage speakers. So what are the pedagogical challenges? So taking all this together, how can we serve this community better? Okay? So when we go to our classrooms, we find this group, and we find this group as well, and we find this group. So we have 3 groups. So how do we cater to them? In some programs, you group these 2 together, and you have a different path for this group. Some people put these 2 groups together. And when we did the heritage track, we put this group separate from the others. Or we gave them the option to be separate from the others. We don't do that anymore because we don't have the resources to do it. You know, there are good reasons to work with heritage speakers that can help. And I feel like, you know, as somebody who is somebody of Arabic background living in the United States, I feel like, you know, it is important for us to serve this community because in addition to their really interest in the language, they can serve both communities well in the Arab world and in the United States or in the diaspora. They can be a bridge. They can help with development. They can do a lot of things, good things. So we need to pay attention to them. And we should always, when we look at heritage speakers, because lots of people sometimes when they have heritage speakers, they say they focus on what they don't know. Well, they think they know Arabic, but they don't know. They have problems with agreement or things like that. So I said, look, let's actually look at what we have here. We have somebody who has been growing, let's say, growing up in a small town in the Midwest and has been able to maintain Arabic under very challenging conditions. That's an achievement in itself. Hats off to the families and to the parents. So let's look at it from that perspective as a positive thing and then see how we can work with them rather than discourage them by saying you have bad Arabic or what you speak is really not good. So, you know, validate them. Say, really, what you learn is remarkable. What you have is remarkable. And now let's see how we can do better on standard Arabic, how we can help you in a systematic way, empirically driven way to learn the language. Because I feel strongly about this, that in fact, you know, keep this in mind. I keep always this in mind about this student. You know, that this is an important language for this student and we need to serve them much better. But as a linguist, you know, I enjoy working on this because, you know, it's just an incredible problem to deal with. You have native language that I work on as a syntactician. That's how I started my research. Now I am working with L2 learners and with heritage speakers, and that's really can enrich our understanding of how language work, how to better teach languages, and how better to do research on languages. And this is in a long tradition of Arabic. I mean, this is the famous line from the poem in Hafiz Ibrahim. I always use this line because I really think it captures the essence of linguistic research. What Hafiz Ibrahim is saying here, for those who don't tend to read Arabic, is that Arabic speaking now, saying, you know, I am the sea that has hidden pearls. Have you asked the divers for those treasures? Meaning, you know, this is a language that is rich, and we as linguists, as language professionals, are like divers. Sometimes you are going to come up empty, but many times you are going to come up with some real gems. And these heritage speakers are real gems that we have really to work with and nurture. Thank you. So I'll take questions if you have any.